Well, from my standpoint, and my reflection is going to be to a great extent kind of also a personal trip through memory lane here. Um, Back in the when I became president, which was in 1982, we the District of Columbia was is in a transition from the old system of government to quote unquote home rule. You had a brand new mayor who was home rule. The home rule charter came into existence in about 1974, I think. And then you had Walter Washington, you had Marion Barry, but you also had a city that was really dominated by the business community. They had the power up on the hill because the hill ran the District of Columbia. In fact, the District of Columbia, you had a governing body, but it was the Congress that ran the District of Columbia. And those who had the power in the Congress were the ones who could make things happen here. So you really did not have a democratic institution with any experience where the voters really and working people could really have an impact and an influence, because there was really not the kind of system that allowed the working class to mobilize and make things happen. So it was a struggle for Labor to get a real foothold in this city and make things happen. All of the laws that were passed by the Congress. So you had a city council that was brand new, that didn't have any experience in governing and stuff like that. And everything that was passed through the council ended up in the Congress. The Congress had to approve all the laws and stuff like that. So it was a struggle for working people to really have an impact and an influence, because if the people who were elected, any laws that they passed were laws that ended up at the Congress. Anything that working people wanted to have, we really did not have a place where we could go and have an impact and get things done, whether it was housing, whether it was wages, you just did not have it. So the struggle was one where you had all these different organizations, special interest groups, struggling to have an impact, but not having a coordinated voice. At the time that we conceived JWJ, from my standpoint, it was that there was a need for there to be a coalition of all of these groups that were, when you come to think about it, working for the same thing, but coming at it from different directions without any real coordination. And we needed some institution to bring us together, but an institution that people could not point a finger and say, you are just interested in the little area that you're interested in, and you don't have a broad vision. I thought Labor did. That what brought me into the labor movement was the idea that the labor movement was a social justice movement. And even though we represented workers at the workplace, it was more than that. So that was the vision that I had of labor. It's a social justice movement, but how do we get labor engaged in other things other than the workplace issues, wages, hours, and working conditions? The mission of labor was to go beyond the workplace. So how do we go into the community, follow our members from the workplace to their home, to the parks, to their schools, protect their wages so that The salary, they don't get salary one day and prices go up the next day. So the hard work that we have gotten at the bargaining table was eaten up even before they got to the grocery, paying of rent. So labor couldn't do all of this stuff by itself. We saw ourselves as having a broader vision in the community, but we didn't have the ground game here to really get things done. So a group of us, small group, started talking before it became JWJ. We just started talking. How do we get and work together? How do we build a movement where people don't see each individual parts, but see the bigger group coming together to work for common issues? Hence, this concept of a institution that could bring us all together. That would be the hub. You have all these spokes, and then you had the hub here, and we all were tied together through that hub. And the hub became Jobs with Justice. So here's this organization that was going to be a social movement, but be the voice of all of us collectively in the community, so that people saw us as one movement and not as individual parts, but as one movement. Hence, the Jobs with Justice was created. All of these, now, other people may have different reasons why they became a part of Jobs with Justice. But from labor standpoint, we saw Jobs with Justice as the organization that could be the voice of working people in the community and issues other than wages, hours, and working conditions. Well, the first thing that we had to do was put some meat to the bone, this idea of Jobs with Justice. But so we have this idea, we had to have a structure. And we had to hire someone, or a group of people, to carry out the mission that those of us who were founders conceived that JWJ would do. For me, one of the primary decisions, and one of the best decisions that we made as a nascent group, was hiring Mackenzie Barris, the first executive director, fresh out of college, not steeped in running an institution, but for me that was good, because you had somebody who was fresh, who also had a vision, did not come with any baggage, and she was put in that position, and our role was to come up with ideas, policies, programs, and what the executive director did was to run with it. We had only one staff person. That's all that this small, struggling operation, not steeped in money, could do. So we, in essence, knew that we were limited. So we needed an organizer, a community organizer. And that was one of the best decisions that we made, was the hiring of an executive director who was a community person and who could go out and didn't have any reservations, or what you might say, fear, because it was youth, and the recklessness of youth was what she brought to this thing here, so that there wasn't anything that was impossible. You had a mission, she threw herself into it. So the first thing that we had to do was organize and have the organization grow, and get the organization to develop a reputation. So we had to be strategic in terms of the issues that that we took on. Affordable housing. Taking a look at the budget and figuring out how the budget impacted the community, and fighting for a budget that was a community-based budget. So some of those early fights were to try and get already existing programs implemented so that it would benefit the city. So it wasn't that initially we could point to a legislative victory. The legislative victories were incremental, and we had to first of all grow. And I know that the idea here is that when you're talking about what your success, you should be able to point to specific legislation and stuff like that. From my standpoint, that kind of came later, because Mackenzie and the early board, we had to talk about agreements. What are the things that we could agree and be strategic in terms of the fights that we undertook, so that you don't go in and you don't end up losing and damaging your reputation. So we had to be very, very strategic. So I would say for the first initial probably 3-4 years that we were there, we were trying to build a ground game. And the early fights that we had were fights probably around equity and justice. How do you make sure that your budget is equitable and just and can benefit the community? Then you move on to the next thing, which is specific pieces of legislation. Living wage, affordable housing. So these were incremental steps that we took, and we did not have any major victory until probably 4 or 5 years down the line, because we were actually building. So that by the time we were like about 5 years, we were, I think, ready then to really take on the corporate entities here in the District of Columbia. And that's when we started talking about broadening on issues, social specific legislative issues, and taking issues to the city council and to the mayor and saying, these are the things that we want to do. We want to have a living wage. We've got to raise the minimum wage. And the concept of living wage didn't come until later, because we were focused on raising, quote unquote, the minimum wage. The first victory that we had that I can point to was one that said that the district's living wage would be the federal federal minimum wage plus $1. So whenever the federal minimum wage went up, the district would automatically go up by $1. Now that was groundbreaking. I mean, that was really, there's nowhere else that was done. We had a federal minimum wage, and everybody stuck to the federal minimum wage. We decided that we wanted to have a minimum wage plus $1, and it was a struggle because Chamber of Commerce opposed it, but we did in fact get that one through. Well, it looks so ancient now. Yeah. It looks ancient in view of what that we have now. We're now talking about living wage. And we had a victory in terms of the living wage, and we had victories in terms of affordable housing. But you have got to have, the Martin Luther King concept was that you can't give people the right to go and live in a location for housing if they can't afford to buy the housing there. So you've got to be able to build that people's income and give them the right to, if you're going to be able to go into a place that is a living place that you can grow your family, you've got to be able to have the income. But at the same time, you also have to be able to make sure that when you leave the workplace, you're able to enjoy the community that you actually live and work and play in, because it is the instrument that impacts their living, their everyday living. From the moment you open your eyes to the moment you go back to bed, the budget that your community has worked with provides the basis for what happens in your community, whether it's security, whether it's for people who are elderly, even for folks who go to your schools, your streets, everything. The government has an impact upon what you do from the cradle to the grave. Everybody talks about the business. Even business relies on government. In fact, we live in a society that I like to say is corporate socialism. If you know what that means, is that you have a socialistic society, but it protects the corporations. Corporations will talk about wanting to have a free enterprise system, except that they expect the government to make sure that they're able to make a profit. If you think about it, if government can guarantee that and build the structure so that businesses can survive and thrive, why is it that it can't do the same thing for its working class? So coming back to your question is, the budget is essential. There are nuances to it, and this is where, if I may digress a moment also, is that one of the allies of the movement in the JWJ was DC Fiscal Policy Institute. You also had to have somebody who could help us analyze the budget, who could help from labor standpoint. You have this massive instrument that's coming down. You have our workers who work for the government, who are the ones who carry out the budget, whether it's Department of Health, whether it's fire, whether it's police, whether it's the schools. They have employees, and those employees are paid by taxes. So it's the taxes that working people put into the pot. And we have a right to say how that money that we put in there comes back to help and benefit us. And that's why fighting for the budget, it's important. Simplified, the budget is made up of your taxes, working people's taxes. And if it's our taxes that is going to be making up the budget, then we ought to have a say in how that budget is implemented. If that's kind of okay, yeah. Simplified, yep.
I know that every year it's a struggle to get.
Yeah, we go through the struggle. It's because we have billions of dollars, and that money comes from out of the pocket of the citizens, and the citizens ought to have a right. And who is the greatest block of people in that citizen? Working class, working people. Whether you work for the government, you're still a taxpayer. You carry out, and you ought to have a say also in how that money is spent and where it goes. And that's why it's important for working class and working people to have a say in how the budget is put together, and then more important, how it's implemented. I think that for the 20 years that DC JWJ has been in existence, I think that from my standpoint, and this is personal now, its greatest achievement has been that it has been able to bring allies together at the table. We can point to specific victories, and yes, but those victories wouldn't have been achieved if JWJ had not carried out its, in my opinion, the mission that I saw, which was coordinating different elements in our community to speak with one voice. And you named the great victories that we have had here, whether it's the living wage, whether it's immigrants' rights, making sure that our elders and seniors are taken care of. It's been because it has been able to get allies together, the faith community, working people, the elderly, to all come together and work as a team, mobilize. Its greatest victory, if I might say, is the growth that it has had in the number of people that it has been able to bring into a room. It goes back to the Labor Council is a coalition of labor unions, private sector and public sector unions. I've come onto this on the theory that, you can go into a room by yourself, or you can go into a room collectively. And collectively, you achieve more than going in by yourself. So that's the principle that we start off with in the labor movement, that you have all of these individual unions, healthcare unions, public unions, construction unions, all of them who have come together and they operating that we can be separate entities, but in order to be able to have impact, you've got to be able to speak as one. Let me give another example. You can have your 5 fingers and you have a bucket full of water and try lifting it up with 1 finger. Try lifting it up with 2 fingers and see what your success is. Now you have 5 fingers and you have a wrist. You bring it all together. You wrap it around the handle of that bucket. And what are the successes? What are the chances of your being able to lift that bucket with all 5 fingers and one called a hand, as opposed to each individual finger trying to lift that bucket? A simple oversimplification, but I'm doing it for a specific purpose. So the unions come together. The Metropolitan Washington Council is the voice of all of the unions in the Metropolitan Washington area. But here is the obstacle that we have. We are a collection of many, but not all workers belong to a union. So what is our mission? Just to speak for our members or to speak for all workers? Those of us, the Metropolitan Washington Council's leadership sees itself as the voice of working people throughout the Metropolitan Washington area. So what we do is to speak not for those who are members of the union, but are working people in our community. And that's what the Metropolitan Washington Council does and sees its mission as. So what brought us into JWJ is, it isn't that we are co-equals working together. We see, or at least I see, the Labor Council as part of JWJ. It is one institution inside of JWJ. So it is not all of these organizations coming together and you have JWJ by itself. JWJ is the labor movement. JWJ is the faith community. JWJ is the elderly community. JWJ is the immigrant community. So all of these communities have got to say, we're gonna strip ourselves of this me, and think about us. So JWJ is the us. And what we do as a organization is work within JWJ, and not that JWJ is part of the labor community. On the contrary, the labor community is part of JWJ. Now, there may be others who may have a different concept than mine. That's why I said this is kind of a memory trip for me, because I had a concept of what the labor movement needed to be successful, and what we needed was JWJ to be successful. And that is what I see JWJ's mission and success is, that it has brought, if you look at the list of organizations that are part of JWJ, you can see where it started, 5 or 6, to where it is now. Its battles and its victories in terms of the fight for immigrant rights in this city. The immigrant community, the immigrant who would not have been able to look back at the victories that have been scored without all of these organizations working together, and having a perception or an understanding of the value of immigrants as individuals. And here's another aspect of JWJ, is that not only did it organize, but it is also an educational institution. Because in order to be able to get something through, you have got to educate the community. And JWJ's ability to go out and work in the community, as a community, organizing the community, but to organize, you also have organizing. Education is part of organizing. You can't organize and mobilize without educating the people that you're organizing and mobilizing. So you look at where the immigrant community, and I'm one. I know how valuable it is, because I know what it was like for immigrants before there was a JWJ, before there was the faith community, all of these organizations who had a concept of justice and equity. But in order to implement it, we all had to come together. The place where we came and reside and got all of this done was JWJ, the ability to go out into the community and organize people. The day labor organization, that was a concept of JWJ. Looking out there, recognizing that the immigrant community, otherwise known as day laborers, were being exploited. And it created a housing where day laborers who were working and people who were family people could come, express themselves, and have a voice going out there and speaking for them. It wasn't just labor, it wasn't just by church, all working by themselves. It was JWJ with this day labor program that we came up with and implemented, and other things came out of that. You go out and you make sure that you're able to, people who are day laborers are treated with dignity. And it was JWJ that did that. And I was there at the creation of that day laborers program. I know it. I know the work that Mackenzie and Arturo and others did to where that program is now branched off on its own. And I am certainly proud of the work that JWJ did in creating the day laborers institution. Holding the coalition together. It needs to hold the coalition together. Continue to speak on behalf of working people, more so those who are the underclass, and coming up with a plan to transform our society, so that rather than being reactive and coming at things piecemeal, is having a strategic plan. I'd like to see JWJ developed a 5-year, 10-year strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan, incrementally come up with a strategic plan for the next 5 years, and not be so overly ambitious that when you talk about the next 20 years, I'd like to take a look at it in terms of 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's how I think the contribution that JWJ can make is pushing the envelope and demanding of our leaders that they truly become the servant of the people, and not the servant of the special moneyed interests. Now that may sound trite and stuff like that, but what has brought us this far has been that there's been a group of people who believe that it's the working class that ought to be driving the train in our society. It is not the corporate class. It is not the 1%. It is the 99% that ought to be driving. So what I envision is where will JWJ be the next 20 years? Let's take it 5 years at a time. Okay, and if you build, when we started this organization called Jobs with Justice, we weren't looking 20 years down the road. If you run into anyone who tells you that they were thinking about 20 years down the line, you sell them the 14th Street Bridge. It was a day-to-day struggle. Now we have reached a point where we can talk about, we have the mini luxury of thinking, of projecting, and the projection, but let's not be overly ambitious in terms of our projection. Let's take it again incremental. What are going to be the challenges for us over the next 5 years? What are going to be the challenges for us over the next 10 years? And let's focus and taking on those challenges. What kind of society do each of our parts see us having in the metropolitan Washington area, especially the District of Columbia, and then working towards it. The regular bread and butter issues we're going to be still fighting about. We're still going to be fighting for a living wage. We're still going to be making sure that that our immigrants have a path to citizenship, and that they are become an integral part of our community. We're still going to be talking about housing. We're still going to be talking about the budget. But what we need to be doing is figuring out what is it that our community ought to look like next year, the year after, and not be too overly ambitious and start talking about the next 20 years. Sounds good, and it's a good brand to have, JWJ and its vision for the next 20 years. I'm not quite sure that my mind is there. What is JWJ going to be doing for the working class people over the next 5 years? No, but you might get caught up. Here's the danger. You can get caught up in this. We are now going to be celebrating in this celebration. So why are we celebrating? And what is the brand that we ought to be coming up with? What are the little catchphrases? JWJ plus 20. JWJ in 25 years. Why 20? Why not 25 years? So my point is that let's not get caught up in the celebration and start thinking that somehow or the other these 20 years came because those of people who started it, including yours truly, had a vision about 20 years. Yes, I had a vision, but I didn't envision that JWJ would still be around 20 years and having achieved the things that it achieved. Let us reflect. Yeah, let's not live in the past, but let's reflect on the victories of the last 20 years, and let's figure out then how we make sure that we do not lose those victories, because our adversaries are not going to be saying, you have achieved those victories, let's move on. No, they're going to be looking for ways of taking back the victories that we have achieved. So we have got to be vigilant, and we have got to be able to say we have held on to what we achieved, and now we are going to improve and build upon the victories that we have had.